Our first guest to present to us now is Brad Holzberger, who is Chief Investment Officer of Q Super. He was appointed to that role in February 2009. His job is to implement the investment policy of this award-winning fund as set by and under the supervision of the Board of the Trustees through the Investment Committee. Prior to joining Q Super, Brad was a senior executive in asset management at QIC for 15 years, where he had responsibility for investment strategy, and before QIC he worked for an asset consulting firm, and in fact before joining the financial services industry had a long career as an army officer. So a nice well-rounded career, and I'll be interested to hear how Brad approaches this thorny topic. Brad.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. And one of the advantages of having all that stuff is that I've been around for a while and you see things. I noted that the response there was that peer allocation or peer pressure sort of affects asset allocations, we think. But let me also remind you of the data that we all see every day, which is that when we look at the default funds of particularly the larger superannuation funds in this country, they are not only very similar, but they don't change. Over the last 25 years, we've seen at least 3 financial crises, including the current one, which is probably fundamentally changing absolute and relative yields between assets. In addition to that, we've seen some very material tax changes to end benefits. We've seen contribution rates change from 3% to 9%, and prospectively now to 12%. And we've seen large funds mature and adopt very different strategies. Some are getting larger, some aren't. And the membership of these funds is sort of coalescing a bit, and they are different. They're not necessarily all the same members. So in spite of that backdrop, I would ask you to think about why asset allocations don't change, haven't changed, and we don't see a lot of momentum when we look at the data. So what would lead us to change? And before I go on, of course, the implication of that is that despite all those things that I mentioned, if the asset allocation of the funds hasn't changed, the risk that you are exposing your members to has changed dramatically. So risks are not being held constant. What's being held constant is asset allocations. So what would lead us to change? To kick off the discussion and to create some, perhaps some controversy, I would ask this question. What, as trustees, do you see your role as? Is it to be the director of a financial enterprise, which is committed to things like growing its members, growing its funds under management, to discerning value add by how your default return compares to the default returns of other funds over various timeframes? Do your members come and go, or your default members in particular, come and go on the basis of those relative returns? Because the implication of that is that your peers matter a lot. And if I was a chief investment officer being instructed explicitly or implicitly that beating my peers was a desirable goal, then I would follow a strategy of having an asset allocation very like them and seeking comparative advantages in various places to try and beat them. But you do have that problem then, that if you maintain that asset allocation, you are following a guide which has got nothing to do necessarily with your particular fund or your particular peers, your particular members. You don't have to talk about economic environments too much. You don't have to talk about prospective returns too much if what you're doing is following your peers. So that would be if you were the director of a financial enterprise. However, if you were the trustee of a super fund who had a fiduciary responsibility to fund the liabilities of a default member, you might do it quite differently. You might ask a lot of questions about what those members look like, about how their risks change over time, about how things like tax, contribution policies and all that affect them. You might notice that some of those members have very different profiles of contributions, very different account balances, and certainly very different amounts of time before they retire. And all those things could cause you to adopt very different investment strategies for those members. Just let me talk for a moment or two about how Q Super has responded to that, just as an example. And we are very much on the start of a journey. And what I'm going to talk about is where the future lies. At the moment, all of the default members of Q Super are invested in a single strategy. We have changed that strategy of late, and many of you would be aware that the fund's strategy for its default now looks quite different to the average strategy of super funds. We've withdrawn Q Super from the rating surveys and things like that because it's no longer relevant as a comparator for our fund. But that's very much an interim position, and the future is all about thinking about the various cohorts of members that exist and asking ourselves the questions I spoke about before. First of all, what's the account balance of the member? And what's that account balance going to look like over the life cycle that they will be in the fund? You immediately then start thinking about the sequence of returns that will be faced by the members, because it's not much point saying we want to get CPI plus 4 over the life cycle of the fund, because at times CPI plus 4 might not be relevant. And the other thing is, of course, that the actual internal rate of return for that member will not be CPI plus 4. And if you don't know what the internal rate of return that the members have accrued at any point in their lifetime, how can you make assessments about what the future risk that should be taken is? The three key things that we feel need to be identified around any member or any group of members is their exposure to inflation. I'm often asked as an investment professional, do you think we should be investing more in inflation? Do we need to hedge the inflation risk of our members? And my answer to that, it depends. Our young members in our fund already have an asset called their future wages, and from that they will make contributions, and those wages and contributions are already almost perfectly hedged to inflation. It makes no sense to buy more inflation protection. But if you think about the older members of our funds, they are potentially close to the point of retirement. They probably haven't got enough money to fund their retirements completely, but they have got enough money to make a difference, and purchasing power makes a lot of difference to them. And so at a given point in time, you would be preoccupied with thinking about inflation risk for some members. You could think about interest rates. And again, if we're thinking about members who have to acquire a set of assets and then within a relatively short period of time retire and start drawing down those assets, putting aside the whole debate about annuities, you are effectively creating the need to annuitise, and interest rate risk is enormous for those members. But there are other members in the fund for whom interest rate risks might not make much difference at all. So you would have a different inflation exposure, a different interest rate exposure for various cohorts of members in your fund. And the final major strategy part to think about is the exposure that you would have to growth assets or risky assets. For many members of the fund, the younger members particularly who have very few assets, that doesn't make much difference. To the older members, it can make a lot of difference because they have got an accumulated balance, but what they haven't got is time. So when people say, and I'm talking about time even through their point of retirement, when people say, members have long investment horizons, therefore you can invest in growth assets. Well, some members have long investment horizons, but not many assets often. Other members have a lot of assets, but actually quite short investment horizons. So you can't make unilateral comments about whether or not we should have more or less growth assets. In any event, those three things, inflation, interest rates, and your exposure to risky assets, are in combination the three things that will make most difference to the final retirement incomes of default members, and the exposure that you would have to those members is very different. I've talked a bit about age, but it's not the only thing that impacts it. We know, for example, that the members of Q Super, the younger members of Q Super, some of them are males and some of them are females. And the females will have a very broken career path typically and much lower contributions, therefore a different sequence of returns. So you get the flavour of where we would be going with that aspect as well. Something to think about. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. Yes, indeed, a lot to think about. David Neal is going to present to us next. He's the CIO for the Future Fund, where he's responsible for the management and leadership of the investment policy team who invest the assets of the fund, also the Building Australia Fund, the Education Investment Fund and the Health and Hospitals Fund. He joined the fund in 2007 from Watson Wyatt, Australia, where he was head of investment consulting. He spent 15 years with that fund. He started his career in the UK and then moved to Australia to establish and lead the firm's investment consulting business in Australia. So, David, I welcome your thoughts.
Thank you. I'm going to add one little word, I think, to the end of that title, Rethinking Asset Allocation Process, because, and really pick up on much of, probably all of Brad's theme there, which is that the most important thing I believe that funds can do, that trustees can do, is to think really, really hard about what it is that they are doing and why they're doing it that way. So if you were expecting us to come and talk about what is the right asset allocation, should we have more bonds or not, then I think you'd be disappointed, because my experience 5 years ago of joining the Future Fund was having a clean sheet of paper, an objective of CPI plus 4.5 to 5.5, and no process whatsoever. And 5 years in, I'm still thinking about the process, because it is an immensely complex task. Turning an objective into and applying an investment philosophy, and then turning that into a process for going and investing in assets is an incredibly complex and difficult task, and we have to constantly reassess how we're doing that and whether we're going about that in the right way. And as I've been through that process and then look back to my days of being involved in the superannuation industry, I think that that's the biggest deficit. It's that there is an immediate leap that is made in an oversimplistic investment philosophy and approach, and that is what I would suggest that the industry needs to challenge itself with. You know, our particular objective is clear. It's written down. There's you'd think not much that you could do to challenge that. Our board sat at the very start back in 2007 and said, we have only one thing to achieve, and that is a real return over the long term. Any concept of peer group comparison is absolutely not appropriate, and we've attempted to claim that ground ever since in our sort of public communication. And the reason we've worked hard at that, and the board has been very, very clear about that, is that it does affect the way you invest materially, in our view. The first thing is it translates the definition of risk from an absolute one to a relative one. I remember early on in early in the life of the fund, towards the end of 2007, markets were somewhat awkward, shall we say, from an investment perspective, and there was a great temptation to want to reduce risk, but we were still building towards some sort of concept of what our long-term strategy might be. And so what was reducing risk? If we thought the future was uncertain and you were investing relative to something, whether it be a benchmark, a strategic asset allocation benchmark, or whether it be a peer group, reducing risk means going to that benchmark weight. If you don't know what's going to happen, you want to eliminate that risk. And it became very obvious to us early on that that would be a disastrous thing for us to be doing. If we abdicated any responsibility for the absolute return and risk of our portfolio by doing that, then certainly the return on the fund would have been a lot worse than it has been. And I think that that would have been completely inappropriate. And in effect, that's what I think peer group risk measurement does. If a new idea comes along and a trustee board gets presented with the new investment opportunities and it's an exciting one, strong risk-adjusted return, if it's not in the benchmark, if the peer group doesn't have it, it gets risk-controlled down to a negligible amount. That can't be the right thing. So I think it's worth thinking about how, well, perhaps it's worth just talking a bit about how we go about that process, because there's one thing that a benchmark does, there's one thing that a peer group relative thing does, is it gives you an awful lot of comfort. It's a nice anchor, it's something to hold on to compare yourself to feel as though you're not too much out on a limb. Once we've done away with that, you suddenly feel somewhat adrift for a while. And that's why I think you've got to think very, very hard about an investment philosophy and approach. Because if you don't know what it is you're trying to do, if you haven't got a very clear idea of exactly how you're going about running this portfolio, how you think about markets, then you can find yourself getting kind of pushed around, tossed around in the storm, if you like. So our approach has been to think about a total portfolio, a single portfolio. By that I mean we don't want to see ourselves breaking it down into different sectors, the way that a traditional sort of strategic asset allocation process might. And the reason for that is that we want to compare all the good ideas that we can find in the world, all the good particular subsector strategies that seem to us to have high risk-adjusted returns, and we want to line them all up against each other and select a portfolio from all of those ideas. As soon as you start to put silos, if you send the property team off to develop a property portfolio and you give them a certain capital allocation, guess what? They'll go spend it. And whether those property ideas are as good as the ideas that you've got in a credit portfolio or not, they will spend that money. And that creates an inefficient portfolio and one that will not have the best chance of meeting the objective. So we've had to develop an approach and a process which brings together something along the lines of 35 to 40 different ideas at any one point in time. Think, if you will, of us running a 40-stock portfolio. Each stock is a particular strategy. It might be a lending strategy in Europe because we think that the banks are kind of out of that business for the time being with their balance sheet problems. And so there's an excess risk-adjusted return from providing that lending into Europe. We want to compare that strategy to domestic infrastructure or to emerging market equities. And we want to think about where that marginal dollar might go between those strategies. And being freed up to do that and not have to think about, but are we too far away from what everybody else does, is an incredibly powerful and liberating approach. And it means that I think that we can genuinely feel as though we are attacking the CPI plus 5 objective with the best possible approach that we can find. Just to think about how risk management works in that sort of context, if you haven't got a peer group measure or a strategic asset allocation measure to use for risk management, you need to think about it in an absolute sense, and we do that through a scenario sort of based approach. We think about under what circumstances would our return be too painfully low, and constructing a portfolio that is robust to that. That means that we're not necessarily building the portfolio that is going to do the best in our central case. If we think about how we expect the world to unfold, we may not build a portfolio that targets that central case because we need to, because risk management is an absolute exercise in the way that we approach it. So we might well take risk out of the portfolio if we think the downside scenario is too painful. Right now would be an example of when we're doing exactly that. We don't necessarily think the world is doomed, but there are certainly plenty of scenarios you can build which I think have reasonable probabilities that look like the investing that would be tough for investors. And so as a result of that, we think it's prudent to reduce the risk profile beyond what you perhaps might otherwise do if you were just focused on a central case. The other element to the process is that, as Brad said, a fixed strategic asset allocation has a variable risk profile, quite remarkably, quite dramatically variable. In our view, we should be going kind of counter-cyclical to that. Just when risks tend to be very high in a strategic asset allocation, think 2006 when all risk premium were very skinny. If you had your fixed strategic asset allocation at that point, you were actually running very high risk. It's at a moment like that that we think we should be taking risk significantly out of the portfolio, and to the point where we would contemplate having a portfolio that would not be expected by the sort of casual observer, the observer bringing conventional wisdom, if you like, would not expect that portfolio to achieve our objective. We think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do, because that is about making sure that we do put risk in the portfolio when risk-adjusted returns are high, and we take it out when they are low. So my last point would be avoid, when you're thinking deeply about investment philosophy and the approach that you're going to take, avoid the simplistic statements that people make. We're a long-term investor. People say that a lot, and they say, we're a long-term investor, that means we can. Think very carefully about what the rest of that sentence might look like, because it can lead you down two very different paths, I think, or a multiple of different paths. The obvious one is, well, we can take the volatility, so we can have lots of equities because we can just ride through. And that might encourage you to have a fully invested portfolio at all times. The other statement that people make about long-term investors, and they often bring them together at the same time, is long-term investors, they should be liquidity providers. As the market's falling off, they should be taking advantage of that and buying in, because they can buy into the in when everybody else is fearful. You can't do both of those things. If you're fully invested and the markets go down, you don't have any money to invest at the bottom. Where does that money come from? And so another version of a long-term investor might be to have a reasonable buffer, wait for the bad stuff to come along, the fat pitch as the Americans might call it, and then invest at that time. Just an example of how you need to think very carefully about the investment philosophy you're pursuing, and make sure that the board understands it, the team understands it, and that it's coherent across all of them. Thank you.
That was absolutely fascinating, David, I must say. It was very interesting thinking indeed. Now, Anthony Grillo, Tony I think that people tend to call him, is going to bring the US scene to us. He joined American Securities in 2005 to establish American Securities Opportunities Fund, which invests in public and private companies that are experiencing difficulty, so a very interesting brief. He had worked with the typical private equity people through Senior Managing Director of Evercore Partners Restructuring Advisory Group and Senior Managing Director and co-founder of the Blackstone Group's Restructuring Advisory Group. And he's Vice Chair, by the way, of the Rutgers University Foundation Board of Overseers and Chair of its Investment Committee. So a very interesting perspective, I think, that Tony will offer us.
Well, thank you very much for allowing me to be here today, Geraldine, and the conference. I appreciate it very much. I think the best way for me to be helpful to this conference in the context of this panel is to talk a little bit about the way the U.S. has invested some of its pension money and look at the ways in which the allocations have occurred over a period of time. Just to give you a little bit of background for those who might not be aware of it, in the United States, the retirement activity is generally occurring in three different areas. One is at the federal level with Social Security. The second is in the private industry environment with private pensions, either defined benefit or defined contributions. And thirdly, in self-directed vehicles, what we would call individual retirement accounts, IRAs, or 401ks. So I have a few slides to show you that will speak to how different parties responsible for each of those asset categories think about allocating their assets within those categories. I'll also offer you one small sort of outlier. One of the things that this panel is speaking to is how parties responsible for assets either look at benchmarks or don't look at benchmarks. In the United States, one category of assets which had outsized returns was led in the endowment environment by the folks at Yale University, an individual by the name of David Swenson, who years ago started a particularly different approach, and I'll just comment a little bit on that as well. So, excuse me, the first, just to put it in context, as you all know, Australia and the United States have been the largest investors, that is to say, at least allocation-wise, in equities and in the private, what we call the private equity industry, including real estate. So when you look at America versus Australia, we're very similar in terms of our, I'll call it, direction towards equities and equity-like assets, risk assets, I would characterize them. The trend over the last few years, since the great financial crisis and prior thereto, there's been a movement in America away from the equity environment. There's been a decrease from around 60% to the mid-40s. In particular, there's been even a greater decrease in active management equities. So when the great financial crisis occurred, there wasn't the sort of protection in the active management side that many managers would have otherwise hoped for or forecasted. And so over the last 5 years, we've seen movement into the passive activity in the United States. It's largely been into indices, which are assumed to be more efficient, and if they provide largely the same return, why spend the money on the more expensive asset management? We've also had a movement into the private equity side, which includes real estate. Some people question whether real estate is really what I'd characterize as a private equity product, but in these presentations, that is how we characterize real estate. The one thing to note here as well is that when you look at equities, there's been a movement away from investments in domestic equities as opposed to foreign equities. So at the same time equities have been reducing in each of the portfolios, we've moved from, for a U.S. manager, from U.S.-dominated equities to foreign equities. So there's been a significant move over this period of time as well. Assumed to be that's where the rates of return will be earned. Allocations to the private equity world, as I mentioned, have increased. They've largely been in the private equity space as opposed to the real estate and hedge fund world, but as well, there's been a movement to direct private equity and direct hedge funds. So you'll see, it's maybe a little hard to see the small piece of this chart, but what actually is happening is the managers are moving from fund to funds to direct hedge funds so as to eliminate cost and to improve returns. This chart is, I think, one of the more interesting and more direct charts to look at in the sense of what has happened in the United States in terms of benchmarking and people copying other people's activities. So this was a study done by a Yale professor and a couple of Maastricht University professors, just came out a month ago. And it took a look at where pension funds, these are the 200 largest pension funds, represents about $3.7 trillion of assets, invested their money over the last 18 years. It's actually through 2008, so it's 1990 to 2008. And the line in each of those categories, the line represents the percentage, the average percentage that each of the funds might have, the average of all the funds would have invested in equities. So in the equity category, just less than 60% would have on average been invested in equities over that period of time. The bar, the top to the bottom of the bar, is the 25th percentile to the 75th percentile of investments. So said differently, from around 55% to 65% was half of the pensions over that period of time would have invested 55 to 65% of all their assets in equities. So my interpretation of this chart seems to suggest that the U.S. activity is as interested in comparing each other to one another, and their management of the pension funds as well do the same thing. So it's an interesting phenomenon. It's not one that happens just in Australia, or if you believe it does happen in Australia, it's surely happening in the United States. You see the similar bars available for each of the other categories, again reinforcing the fact that folks stay around the average over very long periods of time. This is the one outlier that I'd like to just identify for you. In terms of the endowment, and I'm involved with the Rutgers Endowment, we have similar kinds of numbers in our endowment. From a very early period, over 15 years ago, David Swenson at the Yale University started to invest significantly in real estate and private equity, and other institutions followed his lead, and they have had very sizable returns over that period of time. The one problem that they did run into, and it was a very serious problem, was during the crisis, the great financial crisis, virtually all of the, I'll call it larger endowments, ran into a liquidity problem because these institutions did not historically keep much capital in the form of cash. So some of these institutions provide up to as much as anywhere between 25 and 50% of the cost of the university is funded by these institutions. So obviously when there was a liquidity issue in the marketplace and they had 100% of their assets invested in illiquid assets, at this time they would have run into significant trouble, and they did. They had to borrow capital and actually fund their schools with borrowed monies. In the recent years, that has improved, and they've had great rates of return over the last 2 years, which recovered and actually outsized their returns. So this is an example of someone going way, way out of the box and actually performing well in that context. But it took, in the United States at least, to be outside the pension arena. It was not able to be done inside a pension sort of environment, which looks to the benchmark as a significant comparable to be considered. And the last point I'd like to make is that for the self-directed funds, those of us in the States who have their own IRA, like myself, or a 401k, we direct those assets ourselves generally. And you can see over the period of time shown here from 1990 through 2010 how the individuals have become more conservative. They've moved out of equities, they've lowered their investment in their own companies. The red bar represents investments in their own companies. And so what you see is that on an individual level, people are becoming more conservative and being more careful. And so while maybe at the pension level, there's still comparability and benchmarking that's done, at the individual level, people are making individual decisions and making adjustments as a result of it. Thank you very much.